The morning room at Harwick Park caught the late September light through its tall south-facing windows and held it like a thing preserved, warm and undisturbed. And it was into this room that Cecilia came with the basket of fresh linen at 9:15 on a Wednesday, because that was her task on Wednesday mornings, and she had never yet failed to complete it without incident. She had learned by then that Lady Beatrice kept to the morning room between 8 and 10, that Miss Dane was usually invited to join her there while the men took breakfast in the dining room, and that the safest course was to move quickly, refold what required refolding, and leave before either woman found reason to address her. The difficulty was that on this particular Wednesday she had been delayed by a spilled pitcher in the upper corridor, and the linen had arrived late, and Lady Beatrice Fane was already at the small writing table with a letter half composed and her patience already spent on some earlier transaction Cecilia could not name. The Duchess did not look up when Cecilia entered. Miss Harriet Dane did. She sat on the rose-colored settee in a morning gown of pale gold that cost more than Cecilia's father had left behind in movable assets, and she watched Cecilia set down the basket with the attentive calm of a woman who has learned to find her amusements in small things. Cecilia moved to the linen press along the far wall and began her work in silence. "You were to have this done before 8:30, Lady Beatrice said, still not looking up. Her voice had the quality of a blade tested against a whetstone. Not raised, but finer for the restraint. "Forgive me, my lady. There was a matter in the upper corridor." There is always a matter somewhere when one lacks sufficient attention to one's actual responsibilities. Lady Beatrice turned in her chair then and looked at Cecilia fully for the first time. Her gaze traveled down and stopped at the linen basket. "The girl has no idea what she is about," she said, addressing these words to Miss Dane, as one might offer a remark on the weather, a statement not designed to wound because it was not designed to land. "She has been here 7 weeks, and I have yet to see evidence that she belongs." Miss Dane made a small sound of sympathy and said nothing. Cecilia folded the linen. She kept her hands moving. There were 9 years of practice behind her hands. 9 years of her father's office, of helping with the copying of deeds and the filing of correspondence and the management of papers that the clerk could not be trusted to organize. And her hands knew how to work without instruction from the part of her that was being spoken about, as though it were not present. The difficulty began when she turned to take the empty pillowcases from the lower shelf, and the corner of the press door swung back on its hinge in the draught from the window, and the brass fitting at its corner struck the china figurine on the shelf beside it, and the figurine tipped and shattered on the floor at Lady Beatrice's feet. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled to its limit with Lady Beatrice setting down her pen. Cecilia knelt at once to collect the pieces. She said, "I am sorry, my lady. It was the draught from the window. I will see to it immediately. You will stand up," Lady Beatrice said. Cecilia stood. The Duchess rose from her writing table and crossed the room in 4 steps, and the blow came before Cecilia had fully registered the motion. A flat, open-handed strike across her left cheek that snapped her head to the side and left the room ringing. Miss Dane made no sound. The housekeeper, who had come silently into the doorway a moment before, made no sound either. Only the small fire in the grate continued its work, indifferent. Cecilia did not raise her hand to her cheek. She was aware of it because it was impossible not to be aware of it, the heat climbing from jaw to temple, but she held herself still because her hands were the only things under her governance, and she had learned to govern them. "Out," Lady Beatrice said. "Out of this room. I will speak to Mrs. Quill about your tenure here." It was in this silence, the Duchess already turning back to her writing table, Miss Dane examining the floor, Cecilia measuring the distance to the door, that Lord Harwick appeared in the corridor. He had not been there a moment before. He appeared as large men sometimes do, suddenly and without sufficient warning, filling the doorframe in his dark morning coat. And he looked from Lady Beatrice to Cecilia in a single unhurried survey, and the quality of his stillness was unlike anything else in the room. He said, "Miss." He said it quietly and simply. "Come out of there." It was not an invitation. It was a directive, and she obeyed it. And behind her, she heard Lady Beatrice begin to say something, and heard him answer it in a voice too low to parse. And then she was in the corridor with the door closed behind her, standing with her back to the wall and her left hand finally raised to her cheek. If there was something she had not planned for, it was that. She had planned for many things. She had planned for the mortgage's complexity, the questions of legal standing, the possibility of a hostile heir. She had not planned for the particular quality of Lord Harwick's stillness in a doorway, or the way a single word from him could function as shelter. She pressed her palm against her cheek and breathed. The morning continued at Harwick Park as it had before. She did not. Her name was Cecilia Vane, and before she was a maid at Harwick Park, she was the daughter of Mr. Francis Vane of Wiltshire, a solicitor of modest practice and immodest scrupulousness who had spent 41 years in the service of clients who sometimes rewarded his precision and sometimes did not. He had been tall and thin, with ink-stained fingers and a habit of reading contracts aloud to ensure he heard the weakness in any clause, and Cecilia had grown up seated beside him at his desk. During the school hours her mother could not afford to assign to a governess, learning to copy by learning first to understand what she was copying. Her father had died in the November of the previous year, leaving behind a small house in Wiltshire, a respectable collection of legal reference volumes, and a deed of mortgage on Harwick Park in the county of Somerset, signed by the late Viscount Harwick in the autumn of 3 years prior, for a sum of £14,500 at 4½ %, due in full by the close of the following Michaelmas term, now 6 weeks hence. He had acquired it reluctantly. That was the correct word. The late Viscount had come to him in distress, explaining that the London Bank had called in its original note and that a brief private arrangement at reasonable terms would allow him to maintain the estate until the eldest son returned from the continent and could review the position. Her father had written out the terms clearly, had read them aloud twice in the late Viscount's hearing, and had filed the deed in the leather case he kept behind his desk for instruments of the highest consequence. He had told Cecilia of it that evening in the ordinary course of his narrating his day, which he did when she brought his tea, and she had listened as she always did. And then he had died, and she had found herself in possession of the leather case and everything inside it. The sum was too large for a woman alone to manage through correspondence. She understood this clearly. She understood also that the new Viscount, Edmund Ashford, Lord Harwick, to whom all debts and assets of the late Viscount now properly fell, had returned from the continent within 6 months of his father's death, and was now in residence at Harwick Park. She had written twice to the London Bank, who held no record of the mortgage. Because, of course, they did not. She had written to the family solicitor, whose clerk had replied that Lord Harwick was not receiving correspondence on financial matters until the spring assessment of the estate was complete. She was 22 years old and sole heir to her father's legal instruments, and in possession of a claim that could, if invoked through the proper channels, remove Lord Harwick from this estate in 6 weeks. She had not come to invoke it. She had come because she believed a woman holding such a claim had a responsibility to understand the man against whom she held it before she placed it in his hands. She had come also because she could not afford a solicitor of sufficient standing to represent her interests in London, and because the estate's housekeeper had advertised for a chambermaid through the Salisbury agency, and because it had seemed to her a sensible one. She would observe. She would form a sound opinion, and she would present herself properly when the time was right. She had been at Harwick Park for 7 weeks, and she had not yet formed the conclusion that it was time. She had formed conclusions about other things. She had formed a conclusion about the kitchen garden wall, which had partially collapsed under the weight of the autumn ivy and which no one had authorized a mason to repair. She had formed a conclusion about the household accounts, which she could not see directly, but could infer from the provisioner's delivery days and the frequency with which Mrs. Quill sent back unordered items. She had formed a conclusion about the late Viscount's management, which had been, from all evidence, a prolonged exercise in optimistic neglect. She had formed a conclusion, also, about Edmund Ashford. He moved through Harwick Park in the manner of a man assembling an accurate inventory of what had been done and what could be salvaged. He was not a man in mourning, or rather, he was, but not for his father. He mourned something more specific, and she had not yet determined what it was. She turned this question over now, standing in the attic's corridor with her cheek still warm, the linen basket forgotten somewhere behind her. If there was something she understood, it was men who carried losses they had not told to anyone. The first time Lord Harwick spoke to her directly, the command in the morning-room corridor notwithstanding. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 12 days before the slap, and it concerned the library. She had been sent by Mrs. Quill to return a volume of estate maps that had been borrowed by the understeward and left in the second-floor passage. The library was understood to be Lord Harwick's working room between 2 and 6 in the afternoon, and Cecilia had knocked, been given no answer, entered quietly, and found him standing before the north window, with a letter in his hand and his coat removed, which she had not expected, and which produced in her a small involuntary stillness she did not have a name for at the time. She set the estate maps on the nearest table, said, "Forgive me, my lord," and turned to leave. "What is that you're setting down?" he said, still at the window. She told him, "Leave it on the large table, not the side table." He had turned slightly, the letter folded now and held at his side. "That table is for things that have been dealt with. The large one is for things that have not." She moved the volume. "Are you from the agency?" he said. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention she had noticed in him before, which was not rude and not appraising in the ordinary social sense, simply accurate, as though he were calculating something against a scale she could not see. "Yes, my lord." "You fold linen quickly," he said. "Quicker than the others, I noticed." There was no appropriate response to this, and she did not attempt one. "See that the house stays warm enough this week," he said, returning his attention to the window. "The cold comes early here. The staff in the attics should have sufficient coals." He was not asking her to verify this. He was instructing her to ensure it occurred. Cecilia, who had grown up transcribing contracts, understood the difference between a request and a directive wrapped in a quieter register, and she understood also that a viscount who was considering the coal supply of the attic staff was conducting himself unusually. "Yes, my lord," she said, and left. She thought about it that evening in her room. The specific quality of his looking, the coals in the attics, the letter held at his side, and told herself that this was not relevant information. She thought about it again the next morning, and told herself the same thing. She had not yet told herself why she needed to be told. If you have stayed with this story, I expect you know what she was becoming aware of, even if she did not. Leave a note in the comments if you have ever talked yourself out of noticing something that was already past the point of ignoring. The kitchen garden wall had been worrying her since the first week. It was a practical concern, and she was a practical woman. And the kitchen garden was visible from the passage she took each morning from the attic stair to the linen cupboard on the ground floor, and each morning she noted that the wall had not been repaired. On the morning of the 6th week, at a little before 5, she rose early because the first frost had come in the night, and she wanted to see whether the young salvia against the south garden wall had survived it, which was, she told herself, a reasonable thing to want to know. She had brought her old wool wrap, the one her mother had dyed too dark, and which was consequently not attractive but was unquestionably warm, and she sat on the stone bench inside the kitchen door with the cook's daughter, who was 6 years old, who was named Nell, and who had, 20 minutes earlier, touched the back of her hand to the kettle's side and was now crying with the concentrated expertise of a child who knows that crying is the appropriate and effective response to pain. Cecilia had run cold water from the well pump over the child's hand until the worst of it passed. She sat now with Nell's small wrist in her lap and spoke to her about what was growing outside the window. The chard still upright despite the frost, the bronze fennel gone, but a good bronze fennel always goes to seed, the pale stems of the lovage that would come back in the spring, the first winter lettuces beginning to head. She had spent enough time in this garden to know what was there, and Nell had stopped crying and was listening with the same intent seriousness with which she listened to all new information, as though filing it for later use. Cecilia did not hear him. She did not hear the latch. She did not hear the step. She heard only Nell draw a small surprised breath, and she looked up. And Lord Harwick was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and the early frost light behind him, pale and flat and cold. And he was looking at her with an expression she could not read, because she had not yet seen it on his face before. He had come to check the fallen wall. She would understand this afterward. He had been in the habit of rising before the household on mornings after cold weather to assess what the frost had done to the stonework, because the fallen section had been worrying him too, which was a fact she had not known. He stood there for a longer moment than was required for any practical purpose, and then he said to Nell, "How is your hand?" Nell held it up for inspection. He crossed the kitchen and looked at it with the same serious accuracy with which he looked at everything, and said, "Mrs. Finch will know of a salve. Come and find me after breakfast, if you would like me to ask her." Nell said she would. He went out to the garden wall without another word, and did not look back. Cecilia sat with Nell's hand in her lap and looked at the kitchen doorway, and felt something settle in her chest, like a stone finding the bottom of still water. It did not move after that. She had been telling herself, with some diligence, that her opinion of Lord Harwick was a professional assessment, the kind her father might have formed of a prospective debtor. She had been telling herself that his quality of attention was a function of his character generally, not of anything particular about her. She had been telling herself that she was in this house for one clear and practical purpose, and that purpose did not include the way a man's face looked in kitchen door light before the household was awake. She told herself these things, and knew they had become insufficient. The wound she had not yet named in him, she found 17 days after her arrival, not because he told her, but because she was in the library to return a volume of estate ledgers she had found mislaid in the housekeeper's room, and he was at his desk with a letter open before him. And he was very still in the particular way a person is still when they are reading something that requires them to decide, in the moment of reading it, how much of it they are able to bear. She set the ledgers on the correct table. He did not tell her to go. After a moment, he said, Where were you before you came here? My father's house in Wiltshire, my lord. You have no family there now? No, my lord. My father died in November last. He turned the letter over on the desk, face down, a slow, deliberate movement. His hand rested on the back of it. She could see the small, jade-handled penknife beside the inkstand, its handle worn smooth on one side where a thumb had turned it for many years. My brother is in Bath, he said. Not to her precisely, but not away from her either. He was speaking to a point between them, as men sometimes speak when they are not accustomed to speaking. He was a captain in the 52nd Regiment. He gave it up 3 years ago when our father began to... He stopped. What he did not continue, she understood. When his father had begun to need the funds that had underwritten his brother's commission. He is well otherwise, he said, which was not quite the same as saying he was well. I am told he has a good set of rooms. 2 rooms. A man in one household had told another man in a conversation Cecilia had overheard by the garden gate, and Lord Harwick gives him what he can spare. Cecilia knew 2 rooms in Bath did not constitute a good set, but she understood that this was not a man who had permitted himself to say what the situation actually was. I am glad he is well, she said. The inadequacy of this did not require explanation. I was in Florence, he said. When he needed. I was studying the architecture of older things. I thought I had more time. The fire in the grate shifted and settled. She looked at the jade penknife and thought of her father, who had also given people more time than the situation warranted, and who had also been wrong about it, and who had spent the rest of his life believing that the right instrument applied at the right moment could correct what had been allowed to slide into ruin. I think, my lord, she said carefully, that a man in Florence cannot be held responsible for what a man in Somerset chose to do with his evenings. He looked at her then, fully, for a longer moment than propriety permitted. She kept her gaze level, which cost her something, and then she excused herself and went to find Mrs. Quill. If you are still with me here, then you know already that it could not hold. That the distance she had maintained between what she carried in her tin box and what she was beginning to feel in the library was a distance with a natural limit, and she had reached it. Leave a note below if you have ever carried something that changed the color of everything else in the room. The collapse came on a Tuesday. She was in the linen cupboard on the ground floor at 3:30 in the afternoon when she heard Mrs. Quill's voice in the passage outside, speaking to one of the footmen in the flat, even tone of a woman conveying household business. Her Grace says the girl is to be dismissed before supper, Mrs. Quill said. Her orders were clear this morning. I am to have it done by 5 o'clock. A pause. Yes, Mr. Hartley. I am not in a position to question it. Her Grace's instructions in household matters are what they are. The footman's reply was too low to hear. Cecilia stood in the linen cupboard with a stack of clean pillowcases in her arms, and understood that she had reached the point at which the choice was no longer hers to defer. That morning, Lady Beatrice had appeared in the drawing-room before the scheduled visiting hour, where a small party of local families had assembled for the informal afternoon that occurred monthly at Harwick Park. She had done so with the deliberate timing of a woman who understood that room and its acoustics, and she had addressed Mrs. Carmichael, the wife of the nearest magistrate, in the conversational register of a woman sharing something unfortunate that must be shared. The girl is insolent, and always has been, she had said. I have borne it for 7 weeks out of consideration for the house's disruption. But one can only bear so much. Mrs. Carmichael had said something appropriately grave. Lord Harwick had been in the room. He had been at the window, speaking to Mr. Carmichael about the drainage on the east field, and he had turned at the phrase, and his gaze had moved from Lady Beatrice to the door and back again, But he had not spoken because Lady Beatrice had not yet done anything he could address in front of a magistrate's wife, and both of them understood this. Cecilia, who had been in the drawing room to collect the empty tea things, had heard it from the doorway and continued her work. She took the dismissal letter from Mrs. Quill at 4 o'clock, read it in the housekeeper's room with a courtesy she was not required to feel, thanked Mrs. Quill in the way that she thanked people who were performing an instruction they had not authored, and went upstairs to the attics. Her room held what it had always held: a narrow bed, a small chest for her clothing, and beneath the bed the tin box that had belonged to her father, painted green, with the word "Correspondence" stenciled on its lid in her father's hand. She sat on the edge of the bed, with the box on her lap. She opened it. The mortgage deed lay inside it, folded into quarters, the way her father had folded it on the evening he told her of it, the way she had carried it from Wiltshire, the way it had sat beneath this bed for 7 weeks while she formed her assessment of Lord Harwick's character and his intentions and his worth as a man against whom a woman might place her only legal asset. She had formed it. She had formed it in the kitchen before the frostlight, and in the library with the jade penknife, and in the corridor after the slap, and in a dozen smaller moments she had not permitted herself to name. She had determined that he was not his father. She had determined that the estate's difficulties were not a consequence of his character, but of an absence that had preceded him, and that the question she had come here to answer was answered, and that she had simply not yet faced the answering of it. She sat in her attic room with the deed in her hands and considered what would follow if she walked out of this house with this paper. The new Michaelmas term would arrive in 6 weeks, and the debt would fall due, and there would be no mechanism by which Lord Harwick could know of it before it was legally invoked by whoever the next holder of the deed became. She could not sell it quickly. She could, however, lose it by inaction, and there was no longer a good reason for inaction, except the one she had not examined, which was that she did not wish to become what she was about to become. The woman who had been in this house under false pretenses. The woman who had watched and not spoken. The woman whose name was already gone from the household rolls. She unfolded the deed and read it through. £14,500 at 4.5%, payable by Michaelmas. She had never wished to invoke it. She had come here, if she was honest, to find a way to discharge it gracefully. To offer the note at a reduced sum in exchange for a quick settlement, which she could not have done without understanding whether he could be trusted. She had now understood it, and she was being sent away in the morning. She folded the deed and put it in the pocket of her dress. She went downstairs. The drawing room at Harwick Park ran the full length of the East Wing's ground floor, and in the early evening it was lit by a combination of the last October light from the long windows and the fire that had been built up for the dinner guests who were not yet arrived. Lady Beatrice was there with Miss Dane, who had come to stay for the week, and Lord Harwick was there, standing at the far end near the fireplace with a glass he had not drunk from, and the footman Hartley was at the sideboard. And Mrs. Quill had come in a moment before for some matter of the dinner arrangements, and so the room was more fully inhabited than Cecilia had expected. She had not, she admitted to herself in the doorway, planned this with great precision. She crossed the room. Lady Beatrice saw her first, and the expression that moved across her face was not surprise, but calculation. The rapid assessment of a woman determining which tool best suited the particular embarrassment that had just walked through her drawing-room door. She said, with the patience of someone who had already spent their patience twice today, "You were told that your services are no longer required here." "Yes, my lady," Cecilia said. "I wished to speak with Lord Harwick before I left." "You will speak with no one. You are a dismissed servant. Hartley. She turned to the footman. See this person out. Lord Harwick, at the far end of the room, said nothing. He was watching. Miss Dane, on the settee, was very still. The way she was still when she expected something interesting to occur. Cecilia turned from Lady Beatrice to Lord Harwick. It was a simple choice, but the room felt it. She said, My lord, I have a matter of some legal significance to communicate to you, and I ask your permission to do so now. Her voice was her father's voice, the one he used when reading a contract aloud, level, without effect, requiring nothing from the listener except their attention. Hartley, Lady Beatrice said again, sharply. Wait, Lord Harwick said. The room settled. He crossed the distance between the fireplace and the center of the room, 4 strides, 5, and came to stand before her. And his face was the same face he had had at the library desk when she said the thing about Florence, and she noted it now for the same reason she had noted it then, and with the same cost. She said, My father was a solicitor in Wiltshire. He acquired, 3 years ago, the mortgage on this estate from your father, in the amount of £14,500 at 4.5%. The note falls due at Michaelmas. The bank in London has no record of it because it was a private instrument. I have the deed. She took it from her pocket and held it out to him. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, and then at her, and his face underwent a slow change that she watched with the attention she had given to all things in this house, every small particular of it, his face moving from the thing it had been before to something it had not been. Something she could not immediately name except as the expression of a man receiving information that reorders the room he is standing in. He took the deed. He opened it and read it. Lady Beatrice had come to her feet. This is preposterous, she said. She has fabricated this. Edmund, she is a dismissed maid. She has fabricated this instrument to extract money from you. It is perfectly obvious. I cannot believe that you are standing there reading a forgery. Aunt, he said, without looking up from the deed. Lady Beatrice stopped. He read to the end. He turned the document over and examined the notarial seal and the witnessing signatures and the date. Then he said, to the room, to Lady Beatrice and Miss Dane and the footman and Mrs. Quill and whoever else the evening had arranged in that space, in a voice that was quiet and entirely without emphasis, which was somehow worse for the Duchess than any volume could have been. Miss Vane holds the mortgage. This is her house now. Lady Beatrice made a sound. Miss Dane set down her glass. Mrs. Quill stood very still at the doorway. He looked at Cecilia, and she looked at him, and the fire continued its work behind him. Indifferent, as fires are to the particular weight of a room that has just shifted on its foundation. You came here, he said, to assess me. It was not an accusation. He said it in the way he said most things, level, not needing an answer, but leaving space for one if she chose to give it. I came to understand whether the estate was being managed by the sort of man to whom a responsible creditor could offer a reduced settlement, she said. My father did not wish the estate to pass out of the family. He acquired the instrument as an accommodation. I came to discharge it as one. And have you formed your conclusion? She had a number of conclusions. They ranged from the practical to the ones she was not prepared to state in a room that contained Lady Beatrice and a footman. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was turning the deed in his hands. She thought of the penknife, then he said, You will stay. It was the same register as the coals in the attics, a directive wrapped in a quieter register. She did not imagine he had offered accommodations to many creditors in this tone. You have dismissed me, my lord? She said. Technically. Lady Beatrice dismissed you, he said. She does not own the house." He held the deed up slightly, a small, precise gesture. "You do," Lady Beatrice said, in a voice that had been worn down from what it usually was. "Edmund, I must insist. You are welcome to your rooms here for as long as you wish them," he said, not unkindly. "Nothing else has changed." She understood then what the minimum sufficient response looked like in practice. Not cruelty, not triumph. The correction was in the fact itself, stated simply, in front of witnesses. And the Duchess would have to decide what to do with the remainder of the evening, which she would do, and with dignity. Because Lady Beatrice was not a woman without resources, only a woman whose certainties had just required revision. Miss Harriet Dane looked at Cecilia across the room with an expression that contained, Cecilia thought, rather more understanding than she had previously credited her with. "You did not have to do it this way," she said quietly, once, to no one in particular, before she rose and left the room. She was not wrong. She was also not, Cecilia thought, aggrieved. Merely clarifying. The room had changed, and it continued to change through the weeks that followed, the way a room does when its underlying structure has been corrected, rather than merely redecorated. On the 7th day of November, 6 weeks after the deed had been presented in the drawing room, he signed the instrument of discharge at the writing table in the library, witnessed by a solicitor from Bristol who had ridden out for the purpose, and Cecilia sat across from him and signed her name beside it, and the mortgage was settled at a figure that represented something closer to the fair market value of a patient kindness than a full extraction of what she could have legally claimed. Geoffrey Ashford, Captain Retired, now reinstated at half-pay through a letter his brother had dispatched to the War Office 2 weeks prior, was reported to be in better humor. The tin box sat on the library mantelpiece where Edmund had put it without comment on the morning after the drawing room, because it was her father's, and it belonged in whatever room she occupied. She had not moved it, because she had not yet decided whether to tell him that she found this endearing, which was not the word she would use to a man who had just paid £14,000 for a debt his father owed her father, but was the word that kept presenting itself. He was at the window, in the way he was often at the window, looking at the garden wall, which had been repaired by a mason in October. The ivy cut back and the stones repointed, and was now solid and furred with the dark green of moss at the lower courses, and would not trouble anyone until the next hard winter at least. "Nell's hand has healed," he said. "I know," she said. "She showed me yesterday. She's very proud of the scar." He turned from the window. She had been watching him do this. Turn from the window. For 6 weeks. And she had not yet stopped noticing it. And she expected, with the same accuracy with which she assessed most things, that this was not a condition that would resolve. He crossed the room to the mantelpiece and stood beside her and looked at the tin box. The correspondence stenciled on its lid in her father's hand. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "He was," she said. He read everything aloud to ensure he had heard it correctly, even in private. Mrs. Jennings next door thought him eccentric. "He was right," he said. "You hear a weakness in a clause that you overlook on the page." She looked at him. He was looking at the tin box. "He would have liked you," she said. Which was not the kind of thing she had intended to say, but it was true. And she had spent enough weeks in this house learning that truth, said plainly, was the only currency that actually purchased anything. He reached out and took the tin box from the mantelpiece and held it for a moment, as he had held the penknife, as he held most things, with a kind of steady care that cost him nothing visible, and contained, she suspected, a great deal that was not visible. Then he set it back. "Cecilia," he said. He had not used her given name before. He used it now with the particular deliberateness of a man who had been holding it in reserve and had decided to let it go. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the library window, the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons at Harwick Park always did, the light going gold and then gray over the repaired garden wall. And the first flurry of the season had begun, pale and tentative, the kind of snow that does not commit but merely announces its intention, drifting across the south-facing windows and catching in the moss between the stones. "Stay," he said. A single word, not the same word as before, not the directive, not the registered instruction to a creditor. Something that left room, this time, for a different kind of answer. She looked at the tin box on the mantelpiece, empty now, the deed discharged, nothing inside it but the memory of what her father had held in reserve for the right moment and the right man. "Yes," she said. The snow continued outside. The fire in the grate continued. She stayed where she was, beside the mantelpiece, the tin box between them, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the already warm room. And she did not move away, because there was no longer a reason to. Her father had always said that a deed, properly drawn and properly discharged, left nothing unsettled. She thought he had been right.